Hello and warm greetings. Welcome to the Analyst by Vajiram and Ravi, where we would try to comprehensively analyze 7 articles in 2 different sections. In the analysis part, we'll first have a discussion with respect to the trade restrictions imposed by Mr. Donald Trump on America's trade partners like China, Mexico, and Canada, and its implications on the global economy. Then, in the second article, we'll have a discussion with respect to the rising culture of freebies in Indian politics, with special reference to the Delhi's Assembly's election. Then, in the simplified section, we'll have a look at 5 different articles from a special perspective of UPSC Prelims 2025, along with the value addition. So stay tuned. Now, coming to the very first article of the day, this is with respect to Trump's trade wars. So, after assuming the presidency of the United States of America, Mr. Donald Trump has sought to impose a list of tariffs upon its key trading partners, be it China, be it Mexico, be it Canada. Now, this has implications on the overall global economy, including India. Now, the question which comes to mind is that we have a country like US, which always stood for these values of open trade, free trade, multilateralism, or let's say globalization. Why it has now based itself in this aspect of economic nationalism, what we call as protectionism. So we'll have a look at the kind of different causes which are responsible. And we'll also have a look on the kind of implications which can be there for the global economy, including India. And also, we'll talk about the kind of way forward which is required for different countries, be it US, China, including India. Now, this is a part of GS2, International Relations and Trade. Now, let's first talk about what do we mean by a trade war. Let's see that we have a particular country A. Now, this has imposed tariffs on country B, right? Now, if the country B imposes retaliatory tariffs on country A, we assume that the kind of situation is that of a trade war. Now, again, please understand that it is only important once we are talking about the global economy. This situation becomes important if these countries A and B are dominant player in the world economy. As, for example, we have US and China. Right? That's the reason it has implications on the overall global economic setup. So if you define what a trade war is, it basically implies that when countries impose tariffs or other trade barriers, it's not just about tariffs, it can be other trade barriers on each other to protect the domestic industries or retaliate against trade practices perceived as unfair. That is what the definition of trade war is. Now, as I started in beginning, that why we have a country like US, which has actually now based its policies on this aspect of nationalism. For that, we actually need to talk about the history, right? So post Second World War, we had the United States, which actually talked about the liberal international order. What do we mean by liberal international order? See, liberal international order, it was characterized by free and open trade through different institutions, be it the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, or the enhanced version, the World Trade Organization. Next, it stood for multilateral cooperation through different agencies, be it the United Nations, or be it the International Monetary Fund, or be it the World Bank. Then it also talked about the open markets and globalization of tangible as well as intangible things. Then finally, it also talked about the rules-based order, right? What US always emphasizes in the case of South China Sea, right? For example, when we talk about the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, UN clause. Now over here, what US says is that we need to have a free and open Indo-Pacific that is based on the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, right? So that aspect is of international governance. But again, what we witnessed was a perceived shift, especially after the global financial crisis, which basically saw the bursting of the housing bubble in 2007 and 8 in the United States. And ultimately, it led to a lot of recession. But more prominently, when we experience this, we basically experience this aspect of America's economic nationalism in the campaign before the first tenure of Mr. Donald Trump. That was in 15 and 16, where Donald Trump talked about this aspect of America first. Now, what he basically implied was that there has to be increased domestic production. We need to reduce our reliance on different partners, be it China. We need to reduce the trade deficit, right? These were the aspects. Again, what were the reasons which has led to this aspect of America first or economic nationalism, or what we call as protectionism? The very first is shift in global leadership and decline of US-led multilateralism. See, please understand that especially after the 2000, when we had the China joining the World Trade Organization in the year 2001, what we witnessed was the break of the unipolarity and the rise of multipolarity, right? And the power actually shifted from the Atlantic to the Indo-Pacific. And again, we had different organizations which came into being, be it the BRICS or be it the other organizations. Now, this has basically reduced the overall capacity of the US to lead the different organizations around the world, right? For example, as I talked about, the rise of China, especially after its joining of the World Trade Organization, or the coming of different organizations like the BRICS, right? Or let's say we have different trade agreements. Please understand that it was in the year 2016 that Barack Obama initiated this aspect of Trans-Pacific Partnership, right? But again, it could not fructify because Donald Trump basically came out of it. And then we had the formation of the RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, led by China. Now, this is much more powerful in terms of the overall participating countries, the trade volumes, in comparison to the TPP, which basically is now being seen as CPTPP, that is Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, which obviously does not include the US. Next is job losses and deindustrialization. See, please understand that what has happened after the trade liberalization is that most of the manufacturing capacity of the US, it has been outsourced to different countries around the world, be it China or be it Mexico or other countries. Now, this has led to deindustrialization in the US, right? Also, what, as Mr. Trump has been saying, that there is an influx of migrants, both skilled and unskilled, which are actually taking the jobs as perceived by the people in the US. They are taking the local jobs. Again, this has fueled the resentment among the local people, right? Next aspect, if I were to give you an example, is that of Detroit. Now, Detroit has been seen as an automotive capital around the world. But again, because of this aspect of outsourcing of manufacturing to different countries, it has basically reduced in its size. The manufacturing in Detroit has reduced a lot compared to the previous times. Next aspect is trade deficit concerns. See, the kind of imports which US has, they are more than that of the exports. And it suffered a trade deficit of almost 383 billion US dollars in the year 2023. Can you imagine the volume? And this is a trade deficit of 383 billion US dollars. Next aspect is national security and strategic competition. See, China is emerging as a new player when we talk about new technologies, right? Now, why it has been able to do so is because of one aspect of reverse engineering, right? What the US says is that there has been forced technology transfer, right? And because of that, China has come up with new technologies and it is now competing on equal footing with that of the United States. Also, US has alleged that there have been intellectual property violations by the Chinese authorities, especially in new domains like artificial intelligence or semiconductors or battery systems. Next aspect is that of the critical minerals. China has a lot of critical minerals which are basically used in these emerging technologies, be it, the space exploration or defense or aerospace. So China has a lot of these critical minerals. Next aspect is that of COVID-19 and supply chain disruptions. Now, this COVID-19 disruptions, they basically expose the US reliance over China, right? Be it pharmaceuticals, be it the medical supplies, US became too dependent on different countries, especially China, after the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, this basically made US to think about this concept of reshoring. What do we mean by reshoring? Reshoring basically implies to enhance the domestic production. And for that, US came up with different policies, including these restrictive policies. Now, what have been the key protectionist measures taken by the US? The very first is the tariffs on the Chinese steel, aluminum, and electronics. So US has been imposing tariffs through the Section 301 of the US Trade Act, where a lot of tariffs have been imposed since 2017 on these Chinese products. Also, what you must keep in mind is that we have very sensitive electronic equipments which have been barred from entering into the US, right? When it was basically having its 5G installations. For example, we have companies, Chinese companies like Huawei or ZTE, they have been barred. Next is the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. Again, this is a revised form of NAFTA, North America Free Trade Agreement. Now, again, what you need to understand is that this USMCA, it has very strict provisions with respect to the auto manufacturing and labor standards which are to be followed in countries like Mexico or Canada if they have to export their products to the US. Next is Buy American policies. So US government has come up with these policies, especially with regard to the government procurement. See, in countries like US, you have the government procurement which exceeds to billions of dollars. And over here, the US is actually giving preference to its own domestic companies. Next is Inflation Reduction Act. Now, through this particular act, US is basically providing subsidies to its own green energy firms. Now, this has reduced the exports of European players or Asian players into the US. Next is Chips and Science Act, very important. Through this particular act, US is trying to make its semiconductor industry is the dominant player in the world. It is trying to make sure that the technology transfer with respect to the semiconductor is restricted to these countries like China, right? And it itself, that is US itself, emerges as the key player in the overall semiconductor manufacturing. Next is tariffs on Canada's lumber. So you must know that we have a lot of timber exports to the US from Canada. And over here, the US has slapped tariffs to the tune of 20 to 30%. Next is the tariffs on Mexican agriculture products. Right? So we have a lot of very important agriculture products, be it avocados, be it tomatoes, which are actually exported from Mexico to US, and US has imposed tariffs on them, right? Now, if you go according to what this article says, so this article is again saying that in a bid to tamp down this aspect of undocumented migrants and illicit drug flows, the US has basically slapped a lot of tariffs, and it is in process of slapping a lot of tariffs on these countries. Again, it basically tries to impose almost 25% tariffs on the Canadian and Mexico goods and a 10% on the energy products from Canada and a wide range of goods from China. Next, what the reaction of different countries have been. We have countries like China who have said that they would bring a lawsuit into the World Trade Organization, because according to the Chinese authority, US has committed a wrongful practice. And again, we have countries like Canada and Mexico, which are actually thinking about imposing retaliatory tariffs, right? What we call as now the situation has arisen of trade wars. Next aspect is that what Mr. Trump has said is if Mexico and Canada works upon certain principles. Now, what Mr. Trump wants is to stop the illegal migration, which it is happening from the borders across the Mexico to the United States, right? So again, what Mr. Trump says is that if Mexico promises to basically make its borders robust, we'll stop these tariffs. Also, in response to Canada, what Mr. Trump has said is that there has been a lot of fentanyl which is being exported to the US. Right now, fentanyl is a synthetic drug, and many a times because of the overdose, many people have died in the US. Right, so because of that, the Trump administration has imposed these sanctions. Again, what you must understand is it is not just about the economic aspect. There are different reasons, different geopolitical concerns, different domestic concerns in the US, on the basis of which Donald Trump has taken these decisions. So if you just look at these particular lines, you will come across the same thing. So also, what the article says is that the tariffs are imposed to rectify the trade imbalances due to artificial price barriers. But the kind of justification which is given by Mr. Trump was that it would address the national emergency and the extraordinary threat posed by illegal aliens, the immigrants, and the drugs, including the deadly fentanyl. Now, this basically has a potential risk of a blowback from these countries. What we are witnessing is the retaliatory tariffs. Next aspect is this is going to hurt the US consumers, because see, again, if the other countries would also increase the tariffs, that would make the products higher, that would make the products expensive for the US consumers, right? So it would lead to an upward pressure on the prices that the US consumers pay for the imported products and ignite a broader inflationary trend. Next aspect is that the US has said that we are going to use these tariffs to basically stop the immigrants or these drug inflow into the US. Now, what we call as the weaponization of the tariffs. This situation as weaponization of the tariffs as a countermeasure against the inter-country dispute, right? Next aspect, what you need to understand is that according to the White House, what White House thinks is that the government of Mexico has afforded safe havens for the cartels to engage in the manufacturing and transportation of dangerous narcotics, which Mr. Trump is supposedly trying to stop. The Trump administration has also said that there is a growing presence of Mexican cartels in Canada, right? And again, in order to basically stop that, the Canadian Prime Minister has said that we are going to appoint a fentanyl czar, which would look into this aspect and make sure that this illicit drug trafficking to the US, it basically stops through the Canada, right? So again, what you need to understand is what the US terms this situation is like endangering the national security of the US. Both the illegal immigrants from the Mexico as well as the inflow of the drugs through the Mexico and through the Canada. Next aspect is that Trump has also said that there would be a 10% tariff levy on the Chinese products. And this would be moderate in comparison to what Trump earlier said, that we are going to impose almost 60% tariffs, right? Now, as a response, what China has said is that we are going to announce a 15% counter tariff on the imports of US coal and liquefied natural gas into China from that of US, right? Chinese government further opened antitrust probe into Google. Now again, see, what are the kind of ramifications that this trade war is leading to? A lot of issues. So China is opening a lawsuit against Google because of its antitrust violations. Placed several top US fashion and biotech companies on the unreliable list. That is, many of these companies, according to Chinese authorities, are unreliable. And sets limit on the exports of critical minerals for high-tech products, which US is in dire need, right? Mr. Trump has said that these measures could also be imposed on other areas, for example, EU or other reciprocal tariffs on different countries around the world. And this basically makes the risk of trade skirmishes derailing the global growth prospects, right? And again, obviously, it would have implications for different countries, developing countries, for example, India. Now, what can be the impact of trade wars, and what is the impact of trade wars? The very first is the global economic slowdown. Now, this is but obvious. Just assume that if you have these key economic players around the world, US or China, if they are imposing, including these countries like Canada or Mexico, if they are imposing retaliatory tariffs on each other, that would increase the cost of trade, right? And this would ultimately slow down the overall global trade. According to the International Monetary Fund, it says that it can almost lead to a loss of 0.8% of the global GDP, this trade war. Next is declining industrial production and investments. See, please understand, both US and China are great investors among each other in different countries around the world, right? And investment is based upon this aspect of, or the expectations of profit which a particular entity can have, right? So again, if you have such a situation, definitely it would lower down the investments, and ultimately there would be lower production all over the world, more in some sectors, be it the automotive sector, be it the electronics. Next is price hikes for consumers in the US. Again, as we started in the beginning, that US is a consumption-based economy. You have more imports than exports. So if the overall cost of the imports would rise in the US, obviously the consumers would suffer, be it the electronics, be it the automobiles, right? Now, next aspect is that of food inflation in China. See, you must understand that US is a very important exporter of food items to China, be it the dairy products, be it the pork, or be it the soybean. Now, if the Chinese authorities would increase the tariffs, definitely it would increase the food inflation in China. Next is weakened multilateral trade system. See, already US has basically stopped the appointment of judges to the appellate system of the World Trade Organization. Now, this has made World Trade Organization a very weak body, right, with respect to deciding upon the cases. Now, if you'll have such a situation, definitely the overall system, the multilateral trading system would be compromised, including the overall authority of the World Trade Organization. Next is strengthening of the regional trade blocs. See, again, if the country would not obey the rules and regulation of the World Trade Organization, they would be more inclined to come up with regional partnerships, as China has been doing. For example, the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. This would lead to the formation of more regional organization. Next is China's shift towards other markets. See, please understand, China is the export hub of the world, right? So if the US would be absorbing less exports of China, definitely China would have to look for other options, be it the European Union or the African markets. Now, this would reduce the scope of Indian exports to these places, right? Now, what are the impacts of this particular trade war on India? So let's look at the positive impact. See, the very first is American firms diversifying the supply chains. See, please understand, what happened after the COVID-19 crisis was that many of the firms which were based in China, because of the increased tariffs, because of the increased cost of production, they shifted to different countries around the world. Especially many of these automotive firms, they basically shifted to Mexico. Now again, what we are witnessing is a kind of sore relations between US and Mexico. Again, that trade war which is going on. So India has the opportunity to capitalize upon this aspect. Many of these production firms, many of these manufacturing firms can come to India and produce these specific items. So again, this leaves scope for greater foreign direct investments in the country, and this may benefit Indian manufacturers, especially when we talk about the electronics manufacturing, especially when we talk about the steel manufacturing, especially when we talk about the automotive manufacturing. Next is Indian exporters. They would gain a competitive edge if there would be a rise in the prices of the Chinese exports to the US, you will have Indian exporters which can basically replace these Chinese exporters, right? So that is one aspect. Next is agricultural and dairy exports. The same thing. So if you will have restricted imports from Mexico or Canada into the US with respect to the agriculture or dairy items, India has this particular space. India can capitalize upon this space and export food items, right? Also, we have other items, be it pharmaceuticals or be it electronics. Now, what can be the negative implications of this trade war on India? The very first is tough competition from Southeast Asia. See, what actually happened was, especially after the COVID-19 crisis, many of the manufacturing firms in the China, they basically shifted to Southeast Asian countries. For example, Indonesia, Thailand, or Vietnam. Now, why it happened? Because these countries provided a very good ease of doing business to these manufacturing firms, right? Also, it led to lower production cost in these countries. So what we have, the kind of situation we have in India is still that we have a very complex regulatory process. Even though the government is trying its level best, but there is still a complex regulatory process. So there would be a tough competition from these countries. Next is US-China trade war. See, please understand that if China would not import the energy supplies from the US, I'm again repeating, if China would not import the energy supplies from the US, it would become more dependent upon the countries of the West Asia. And again, if there would be more import from the West Asia, it would increase the overall prices of these crude oil for countries like India. And therefore, it can also have the inflationary trends in the country. What we have mentioned is here itself. Next is China would be more inclined to dump the products. See, if US won't accept the products from China, China would definitely lower down the prices of these commodities and then dump it to the other markets, including India, right? Excess goods into the India. Trade uncertainty, this would strengthen the US dollar. Again, if there would be trade uncertainty, that would lead to the strengthening of the US dollars. And therefore, it would have implications in the terms of higher prices what we pay for the global imports we have of crude oil, right? So again, if we would pay more for the crude oil, definitely it would lead to the increase of the prices of the goods and commodities, right? So this would lead to again higher inflation. Now, what should be the way forward? The very first is strengthening the multilateralism. Very important. See, again, we need to make sure that these countries, be it US or China, they should not use this particular trade as an aspect of solving the geopolitical tensions, right? They should come on board, discuss, be it through the World Trade Organization or be it through the platforms like G20. Definitely we can have a solution. Next is balanced approach. See, we are not saying that the US should not protect its strategic industries. Definitely it should protect, be it the critical minerals or its own domestic manufacturing. But it should not compromise on this aspect of free trade, because it was the US which initially started this concept of free trade, right? Next is strengthening the regional partnerships. What we are trying to say is that we have a lot of these regional organizations, be it the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue or be it the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity. Or what we can do is we can strengthen or we can diversify the supply chains in the Indo-Pacific region, right? So this would basically make sure that we have new markets, right? Next is fair trade and not isolations. What we need to emphasize is that we need to abide by the WTO rules, right? We all agree, different countries came on board and agreed to the principles of the WTO, right? So they must be kept in mind while having trade with the other countries, and the aspect of unilateral tariffs, which US is actually doing now, this should not be done. Next is domestic investments in technology and innovation. This is a must, even for countries like India, right? So we must focus upon becoming self-reliant. US definitely is a leader in the technology aspect, but it should not basically make those policies which are restrictive for other countries. There has to be more technological cooperation among different countries around the world, be it US or China, right? So there has to be this aspect of cooperation more than the division aspect. What can be the way forward for India? The very first is domestic manufacturing, very important, and we have been focusing upon it, including in this year's budget. So we are in the process of coming with National Manufacturing Mission, which would also focus upon clean tech manufacturing. Again, what you need to understand is that we have a lot of MSMEs, which are the growth engine for the exports. More than 45% of Indian exports is basically taken by these MSMEs. So we need to focus upon them as the government is providing them with the enhanced credit mechanism, right? We have different schemes like production-linked incentive schemes. They must be expanded to different sectors, be it the semiconductors or the renewable energy systems, battery storage, or the electric vehicles. Next is diversify the trade partnership. See, again, what we should do is we should come into different trade partnerships, be it with the United States also. India has already come up with the comprehensive economic partnership agreements with different countries. For example, we recently had with the United Arab Emirates, right? Also, we had a sort of a trade agreement with that of Australia. So we can also think about having with US. Next is boost infrastructure and logistics. We have to focus upon the connectivity aspect to make sure that we have a very robust rail connectivity, road connectivity. We have different projects like the Sagarmala or Bharatmala. We need to strengthen them, right? Next is Gati Shakti. So as to have more collaboration among different departments. This aspect of silos, working in silos, need to be broken. Next is digital connectivity, very important. If we need to capitalize upon this aspect of, you must know that we have the India-Middle East Economic Corridor, right? So if you want to basically capitalize upon this aspect of Indo-Pacific Economic Framework or IMEC corridor, we need to have a very robust digital connectivity. Next is explore new markets, very important. Be it the European Union or be it ASEAN or Africa, we should explore new market and make sure that our products are more competitive with respect to that of the products which are exported by the Chinese agencies, right? Chinese manufacturing firms. So what we are trying to say is that this aspect of trade war among different countries, be it US, China, or be it between US or Mexico or US or Canada, it is having global implications, including for countries like India. So these countries need to make sure that they should not make trade as an aspect of geopolitical rivalries. Next aspect is that countries like India should invest in domestic manufacturing, making their products more competitive. They should explore new markets, be it the European Union or Africa, right? So through this, we can make sure that we do not suffer the implications of these trade war and we can have a robust supply chain. So this is what you need to know with respect to this article. Let's have a mains practice question. The question says, the trade wars initiated by the United States have a significant implications for the global trade, economic stability and emerging economies like India. Analyze the key reasons behind these trade wars and discuss their impact on the global economy with a special focus on India. Also suggest measures India can adopt to mitigate any negative consequences and leverage emerging opportunities. 15 marks, 250 words. Do write a particular answer on this question. And yes, if you're really liking the initiative, the enriched content, do let us know through your likes and comments. So coming to the next article, this is with respect to are freebies and welfare schemes different? What we recently witnessed was that during the campaigning of the Delhi Assembly elections, we had the three major political parties, the Aam Aadmi Party, the Congress and the BJP. So they came up with a lot of promises. And many of the critics said that these promises are nothing but freebies. While on the other hand, you had certain sections of the society who said that no, they're not freebies, but they are welfare measures. So this debate has always been there, that whether a freebie can be deemed as a welfare measure or not. So we'll see what freebies are all about, what is the importance or positive aspect of freebies, what is the negative aspect, and what should be the way forward. Now this is a part of GS2, elections and welfare measures. Now, let's first define what do we mean by a freebie, right? So they are nothing but short-term handouts. They're not something which is done for a long-term goal, right? So they are a short-term handout, basically meant for voter appeal. And they lack this aspect of sustainability. That is, how do we basically measure this aspect of sustainability? If a particular measure can have long-term socio-economic benefits, that would basically be deemed as a welfare measure. But if a particular measure is only having a very short-term socio-economic aspect, right, which is not having a long-term view, so that would be deemed as a freebie, right? What are the examples? It can be a free laptop. It can be the distribution of free televisions or bicycles or electricity and water. Again, what you must understand is that it was in 2022 when the Honorable Prime Minister, he himself criticized this aspect of Revidi culture. And this brought to the fore this question about the sustainability of these measures being taken by different governments. So what they do is they first promise, and again, once they come to power, they have to bear a lot of financial resources. They have to use a lot of financial resources, and that is basically nothing but the public resources. And this becomes unsustainable. So this is the aspect. Next aspect is that of the ethical aspect. Can the political parties basically promise the voter that we are going to give you this or this, right? It has to be within the constitutional framework. It cannot be a promise which is arbitrary or which is unsustainable, right? Now, how to basically distinguish this freebie with that of a real welfare measure? See, please understand, whenever the government comes up with a particular welfare measure, it is for a specific population, a target population. And the very objective is to raise the standard of living of the people and to make sure that the resource access is increased, be it the health, be it the education, right? Next aspect is that most of these welfare measures, they are in line with the directive principles of state policy enshrined in the part 4 of the Constitution. Now, what these DPSPs aim to do is to make a welfare state. So most of these welfare schemes, they are in line with that of the concept of the welfare state. Now, the same thing, they basically promote to create long-term human development. They do not focus upon short-sighted view. What they focus upon is having a long-term course of human development. Next aspect is what have been the examples of these welfare measures in the country. So we have the public distribution system, or Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, or for example midday meal, or Poshan Abhiyan, which focuses upon the nutritional aspect of the children. So these can be deemed as the welfare measures. Now, what are the positive aspects of these freebies? See, first is that they cater especially to the lower class or lower strata of the society. Many of these political parties, whenever they come up with a particular measure, which critics say that this is a freebie, that is mostly targeted to the lower strata of the society, which lack resources. So we actually directly cannot say that this is something which is a short-term measure. Next aspect is serves as a foundation for several welfare measures. See, if you'll go into the history of the developmental politics in the country, what you would find is that many of the policies which we have at the national level now, they are basically rooted into the kind of policies which were started at the state level. For example, let's talk about the midday meal scheme. Now, this was started as a scheme in the state of Tamil Nadu by K. Kamaraja in 1956, which finally we have at the national level, right? Next is the National Food Security Program. This was started by N.T. Ramarao in Andhra Pradesh. Next, a very important scheme of the government of India, PM Kisan, right, which talks about the transfer of amount to these farmers. It is inspired from the schemes like the Telangana's Ritu Bandhu scheme or Odisha's Kalia scheme. Next is boost the livelihood production. See, please understand that if we give the sewing machines to the women, or if we provide the bicycles, that would enhance the livelihood opportunities. That would enhance the scope of self-employment opportunities for these sections of the society. And ultimately, it would enhance the productive investments. And this would lead to the overall economic well-being. Next is enhance social welfare. See, most of these freebies, they are directed towards the vulnerable sections of the society, which aim at providing the essential goods and services. For example, let's talk about the free bus passes for women. Now, if the women from the lower economic strata of the society, they are given the free bus passes, this would enhance their livelihood opportunities, right? And ultimately the overall economic well-being. Next is increase access to education and skill development. Once we give the gadgets, for example, laptop to the students, this increases the accessibility of the students. For example, in states like UP, this has enhanced the skills. Also, the Niti Aayog says that in states like Bihar and West Bengal's, the provision of the bicycles has led to the reduction in the dropout rates of the student. Next aspect is strengthening the political engagement and public trust. What we are trying to say is that once we will have these freebies, this would enhance the responsiveness of people. People would trust more into the overall system. So this has been highlighted by the Center for Policy Research that in the states like Bihar and UP, people have become more responsive towards the government, or what we can say is government is more responsive towards the people. Now, the kind of examples which have been provided in this article, it talks about the National Food Security Act, which was launched by the United Progressive Alliance. It also talks about the midday meal or the public distribution system, right? Next, it says that we have a particular report by the Center for Financial Inclusion. It says that carefully designed cash transfer programs channel funds directly to women, not on behalf of their households, not only empower the women, but also help mitigate the risk of intimate partner violence. Next, what the article says is that it is this aspect of the freebies. It is one or the other way linked to the capacity building approach of Amartya Sen. For instance, access to nutritious free food through the midday meal scheme strengthens the immunity and enables the individuals to lead a dignified life, right? In contrast, the poor health not only causes the personal sufferings, but also burdens public resources by increasing the demand for hospitals and medical treatment. So if you just were to have a look at the kind of examples of freebies, we have free power, free consumption goods, and then we have merit goods, what we call as the welfare measures. For example, the public distribution system, employment guarantee schemes, state support, right? Now, what are the negative aspects of the freebies? The very first is the burden on the state exchequer. According to a report what we have is that it costs almost 0.1% to 2.7% of the gross state domestic product. And in some states, for example, Andhra Pradesh and Punjab, this number is more than 10%. Understand, if most of the kind of revenue expenditure would go on these aspects, what would be left for the developmental activities by the state governments? Next is against free and fair elections. See, if you are giving them the inducement to the voters with respect to these freebies, this basically it is equivalent to undue influence on the voters. And again, this is bad for the small parties because they cannot compare or they cannot give the kind of freebies which are offered by the large parties. Next is distortion in the resource allocation. What we are trying to say is that if substantial portion of the resources are going towards the freebies, states are not left with the adequate amounts which is to be used for the other developmental aspect, right? Niti Aayog has criticized the laptops, the distribution of laptops in the UP, and again it says that rather than focusing upon the distribution of laptops, the state could have gone for comprehensive education reforms. Next is dependency culture. What we have seen is that once you have these freebies, it reduces the job-seeking behavior of the individuals, right? And it discourages the self-reliance or the spirit of entrepreneurship among the people. Next is reduce accountability. We are actually not focusing upon the systemic issues and we are providing them the short-term avenues, right? Short-term the sources, and which is actually wrong, which is not in line with the sustainable principles. Next is environmental impact. Once you will provide electricity or water resources free of cost, it would degrade the soil, what we are witnessing in the states like Punjab or other states like Andhra Pradesh, right? So again, it has led to a lot of soil degradation. Next aspect, which is actually provided in this particular article itself, is that the RBI itself, the Reserve Bank of India, has said that the state finances highlights how such measures have led to sharp increase in the subsidy expenditure, and it has urged the states to rationalize these subsidies to ensure they do not displace the critical investments. Again, we have a mention of the kind of approach taken by the Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court has said that the political parties should make sure that they should not incline upon giving such, talking about such benefits or giving such inducements to the voter, right? So in S. Subramaniam Balaji versus Government of Tamil Nadu, the Supreme Court said that such matters fall within the domain of the legislative policies and were beyond the judicial scrutiny. It further underscored that such expenditures could neither be deemed unlawful nor characterized as corrupt practices and sought to advance the directive principles of state policies. Now, what should be the way forward? The very first is strengthening the democratic institutions. We have the institutions, the constitutional bodies like the Election Commission of India. They should come up with effective monitoring policies so that they can regulate the freebies. Next is enhancing the voter awareness. Voters should be well educated with respect to the kind of choices they're making, right? They should not fall a trap to these freebies. They should rather focus upon the long-term sustainable goals. Next is shifting the policy focus. The political parties should basically focus upon the sustainable long-term policy planning rather than these populist measures. Then we have ensuring the transparent governance. Again, what has to be the focus is ensuring the accountability in the implementation of these services or the provision of the goods and services. This would reduce the corruption and it would enhance the overall trust which people have in the overall government machinery. Next is strengthening the social security systems. There have to be the comprehensive measures, for example, the quality healthcare or robust education system, which focus upon, for example, job creation or poverty alleviation, strengthening the credit to the different enterprises or strengthening the entrepreneurial capacity of the individuals. That has to be the objective, not these freebies, right? Also, according to the senior advocate, Sanjay Hegde, he says that little that courts can do distinguish welfare measures from populist sops and pre-election inducements. Legislatures' prerogative to rein in unchecked competitive populism. So it is ultimately the responsibility of the legislature to rein in, to control these populist measures. Judiciary should not intervene in the choices made between the voters and their elected representatives, right? So again, this is an infographic which you can have a look upon. What we are trying to say is definitely this aspect, freebies at one point of the time definitely helped to enhance the overall developmental indicators. But what you need to understand is that greater tendency or greater inclination upon these aspects is not good for a democracy like India, and we should rather focus upon long-term sustainable goals. Let's have a mains practice question. The question says, the rising culture of freebies in India has sparked debates on fiscal sustainability and governance, often being contrasted with genuine welfare measures. Critically analyze the impact of freebies on economic stability and democratic accountability. How can policymakers strike a balance between welfare and fiscal prudence. 15 marks, 250 words. Do write a particular answer on this question. Now, coming to the simplified section, we have the first topic which talks about the very important and strategic port of Chabahar in Iran. So let's talk about the gist of the article. So as we talked in the very first article of the day, that Donald Trump has imposed a lot of tariffs for different countries around the world. Now, in his list of the countries, we also have Iran, for which he has used the maximum pressure technique. And it includes the tariff which he has imposed on the Chabahar. Now, this becomes really important for India because there are strategic investments, Indian investments in the port of Chabahar. That is the first thing. And for years, we have developed Chabahar so that can serve as a gateway to the Central Asian countries and further to European countries, right? So this is something which is of concern for India. And therefore, we have this particular article which talks about the Chabahar port and the other initiatives, for example, International North-South Transit Corridor. And also it talks about how this serves as a counter to China's initiatives in Pakistan, that is China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, as a part of the larger Belt and Road Initiative. So let's go through this. So Trump has again taken aim at different countries around the world, and he has issued the Presidential National Security Memorandum PNSM2, which basically calls for maximum pressure on Iran. And again, what he has called Iran as the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism, and his decision to name the Chabahar port has also sent shockwaves to New Delhi. Now, if you just look at this particular map, just for the sake of the geography, so you have this particular port of Chabahar, right? Now, this is basically in the Gulf of Oman. Just beside you have Gwadar port, where you have significant Chinese investments in Pakistan. This is a part of the larger Belt and Road Initiative, and this port of Chabahar, it links to the border town of Zahedan, and ultimately we have the road connectivity project which was implemented by India in Afghanistan, that is from Zaranj to Kabul, right? So this project was also implemented by India. Chabahar's Shahid Beheshti port terminal is, after all, India's first international port. Do remember, alternative route to Iran, Afghanistan, Central Asia and beyond, and part of its plan for its regional leadership. Very important and strategic port. India had interest in developing this particular terminal to basically bypass the Pakistan's land route and Karachi's port route. Chabahar not only provides a quick sea route from India's west coast, but plans fit within the overall India's developmental assistance to the Afghan Republic, especially when we talk about the construction of Zaranj-Dilaram highway. So if you just look at this particular highway, this is Zaranj-Dilaram highway in Afghanistan, that could take Indian goods around the country. Next aspect is India could also develop Chabahar as a counter to Pakistan's Gwadar port, which is funded by China. Now, you must understand that China has investments. It has said that it's going to invest more than $60 billion in the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which traverses through the Indian sovereign territory of the Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, right? So again, this is something which is of concern for India also. Now, there are different projects which are a part of the CPC. We have the Gwadar International Airport, we have the Gwadar Port Free and Zone, then we have got the coal-based power project, then we have got the coal mining project, then we have got the solar power project, then we have the hydropower. So it's a mix of many things, be it the power transmission line, be it the highways, be it the hydropower projects. It includes a lot of things. Between 2010 and 11, the US encouraged India to increase the energy contracts with the Iran to build the Shahid Beheshti, so that it can basically leverage the Indian partnership with that of the Iran for its own sake, right? The six-nation joint comprehensive plan of action on Iran's nuclear capabilities. Indian investment would give Iran incentive to join the international mainstream with the JCPOA sign. Now, what was JCPO? This was basically, it included the US, UK, Russia, France, China plus Germany, what we call as P5+1. Now, the very objective was to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons and technology falling in the wrong hands. Second was to use nuclear technology for peaceful civilian purpose. This was JCPOA. Trump was then elected. Please understand, JCPOA initially was it was basically taken forward by Barack Obama, but as Trump came, he basically withheld the particular arrangement, the agreement, and came out of it. Mr. Trump walked out of the JCPOA, enforcing sanctions on the country importing oil or trading with Iran. India submitted to the sanctions on oil, stopping its import of cheaper Iranian crude oil in 2018, but it lobbied hard to keep its stake in Chabahar alive. Now, again, India was granted the waiver. In November 2018, the Trump administration decided to add the waivers meant for humanitarian aid for Iran and for Afghanistan reconstruction. So they were only done for the sake of humanitarian projects and not the other projects. Over the next few years, India's trade relations with different countries around the region has basically grown, and also with that of Taliban. So you must know that India has implemented a lot of developmental projects in Taliban, be it that of the Zaranj-Dilaram highway, or be it the hydroelectric projects, or be it the Afghan parliament. So these are some of the very important projects which India has implemented in Afghanistan. Next aspect is, in May 2024, we have the minister, Sarbananda Sonowal, the shipping minister, who basically went to Tehran and signed a 10-year contract for Chabahar to invest approximately 120 million US dollars in equipment for the port and credit window of 250 million US dollars. Also, we have the Minister for External Affairs, who said that India wanted to connect its Chabahar port to the INSTC, International North-South Transport Corridor. So what we are trying to say is that this project would definitely enhance or basically add value to the existing INSTC corridor, right? Given that the order came just days ahead of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's US visit, the South Bloc officials hope that they can once again negotiate for an exception for India's plan for Chabahar port. You can just see in this image, in May 2024, we had the Minister for Shipping, Sarbananda Sonowal, who basically visited Tehran for having more robust partnership for the Chabahar port. So let's see what happens, and this is what you need to know. This is a very important geographical location and can be important for your prelims exam. Let's go to the other article. Now, coming to the next article, this is with respect to National Mission for Manuscripts. Now, the government has decided to allocate almost 500 crores for this particular mission. The very objective is to give it more autonomy. Now, in this year's budget, we had a new mission, that is the Gyan Bharata mission, which intends to cover more than 1 crore manuscripts. Now, it's not clear whether it would be a part of the National Mission for Manuscripts or not. Steps have been taken to make the National Mission for Manuscripts autonomous, with the center allocating nearly 500 crores. The National Mission for Manuscripts was established in February 2003 by the Ministry of Tourism and Culture. Do remember, because such type of questions have been repeatedly come in the UPSC. Mission seeks to unearth and preserve the vast manuscripts wealth of the country. The NMM has been again put under the Central Sector Scheme. Now, we all know the Central Sector Scheme is one where all of the funds are given by the central government and there is no participation by the states, right? It was not clear whether the new Gyan Bharata mission for the manuscripts announced in the union budget last week would be a part of the MMM or not. The Gyan Bharata mission intends to cover more than 1 crore manuscripts. It would undertake the survey, documentation and conservation of the India's manuscripts heritage, lying with the academic institutions, museum, libraries and private collectors. According to the ministry, the National Mission for Manuscripts has documented almost 5.2 million manuscripts, almost 52 lakh manuscripts across the country. It has conserved 9 lakh folios, the papers, the leaves of the manuscripts, and digitized almost 3.5 lakh manuscripts that contain 3.5 crore pages, right? Let's also talk about the Gyan Bharata mission. So the union budget has talked about the Gyan Bharata mission, under which 1 crore manuscripts will be conserved and documented. Special mission for the survey, documentation, conservation of India's manuscripts heritage intends to cover more than 1 crore manuscripts. Key component of the Gyan Bharata mission is a national digital repository of the Indian knowledge systems. It would serve as a platform for knowledge sharing, help in digitizing and centralizing the India's traditional knowledge. Very important, so that we cannot, it's the infringement of the intellectual property can be prohibited. It will be accessible to researchers, students and institutions worldwide. What is a manuscript? A manuscript is a handwritten composition on a paper, bark, cloth, metal, palm leaf or any other material dating back to at least 75 years that has significant scientific, historical or aesthetic value. So this is what you need to know with respect to this article. Maybe a question in the prelims can come. Let's go to the other article. Now, coming to the next article, this is with respect to the United Agency for International Development. Now, this is in line with the articles we have studied, that is the kind of tariffs or the sanctions which the Trump administration is basically levying on some of these organizations or countries around the world. For the Trump administration, such type of organization, that is USAID, they are just a burden on the state exchequer, state resources. And therefore, the Trump administration doesn't want to keep these organizations, and basically it wants that the US should focus upon its own resources, its own development, right? So Donald Trump, along with his billionaire friend and advisor Elon Musk, has moved to freeze all the foreign funding for 90 days. The ramification of this stop work could be too much for different countries around the world, be it Syria, Thailand or Ukraine or South Africa, where the United States Agency for International Development is working. the country's premier humanitarian agency was actively involved. Now, US President, along with Mr. Elon Musk, who heads the newly formed Department for Government Efficiency. Now, the very objective of this particular department is to make sure to cut down the excess expenditure. And for these persons like Donald Trump and Elon Musk, these agencies are a burden on state resources. Has sought to tighten the chokehold by trimming the USAID 10,000 workforce to a mere 294. Just understand the kind of laying off which is going to take place. The next best outcome would be the absorption of the US aid into the United States Department. Again, what we are trying to say is that initially it was an autonomous agency. Now it would be a part of the State Department, right? And we have the Secretary of State who would act as the director of this particular organization. The trio has said that the USAID functioning did not align with the President's America First policy. That is what we discussed in the very first article, and has criticized that the agency has given almost $1.5 million grant to LGBTQ group in Serbia and $2.5 million assistance to an electric vehicle manufacturer in Vietnam. Separately, we have different allegations against this particular USAID allegations for corruptions. The US remains the largest contributor of the foreign aid, despite the amount not being the highest in terms of the fraction of the country's annual budget. So it is almost 0.6% of the $6.75 US trillion. The US aid is a primary source of this assistance. $68 billion spent by the country on the international aid in 2023. The US aid accounted for almost $40 billion, a significant amount. This agency has operations in 130 countries and takes care of different aspects, be it the education of schoolgirls in Taliban, or monitoring the Ebola outbreak in Uganda, or HIV/AIDS control program in the African countries, and is credited with saving more than 20 million lives in Africa. Of late, the agency's primary focus has been the Ukraine, where it buys the produce from the farmers and sells it to the other part of the world. Again, it also provides the prosthetics limbs, the artificial limbs, to the soldiers. India. So it has its work in India also. The agency works in areas like health, education, sanitation, and environment. The US aid was established. Now, this can be a probable question in the prelims, that when was it established? It was established in 1961 by the Democratic President John F. Kennedy. Now, this is but obvious. So it was established by a Democratic president. So you have the Republican Donald Trump, who is opposing this initiative. During the Cold War era, to counter the Russian influence, it functioned under the State Department initially, but Congress made it an independent agency in 1998. Therefore, many experts are saying that the power to dissolve the US aid is only with the Congress and not with the executive. The US has benefited from this independent stature, for it could maintain the bridges with the non-friendly nations such as Iran and North Korea. Please understand that the US aid has also been in touch with different countries who are actually US adversaries, be it the Iran or North Korea. However, the public in the US, primarily the Republicans, always sided with slashing the foreign spending. They don't want this particular agency to work. Experts say that China will step in to fill into the void which is created, which is left by the agency. China's priority has been the visible programs, right? And that's the reason it has basically gone into different countries of Africa and involved those countries into a debt trap diplomacy, right? Which is obviously not sustainable. Visible programs or infrastructure projects undertaken in the form of Belt and Road Initiative. Sadly, the price for the Trump's administration, domestic interests end up being paid by the deprived people across the globe. So this is a very important organization. A probable question can come in the prelims. That is it for this particular article. So coming to the next article, this is with respect to the National Assessment and Accreditation Council. Now, this has barred university in Andhra Pradesh for 5 years from accreditation. Therefore, NAAC becomes really important. A question in the prelims can come. So we have the NAAC, which is an autonomous body, accreditation body for the higher education institutes. Now, this basically it has announced that the Executive Committee has decided not only to cancel the current process of accreditation of the Koneru Lakshmaya Education Foundation in Guntur, Andhra Pradesh, but also debar its university for 5 years for applying for the accreditation. So it has these powers. It can do that, right? The case involves the CBI investigation, the Central Bureau of Investigation, into the alleged bribery of a NAAC team by this particular institute in exchange for A++ rating for its university, right? So therefore, this particular organization becomes important. Now, this particular organization, that is the council, the National Assessment and Accreditation Council, it's a government organization which is headquartered in Bangalore, established in 1994 in a response to the recommendation of the National Policy in Education 1986, autonomous body that assesses and accredits the higher education institutions such as colleges, universities, and other recognized institutions to derive an understanding of the quality status of that particular institution. is it matching the parameters which are prescribed by the UGC or other bodies or not, right? So it basically accredits them. Funded by the UGC and evaluates the institution in terms of their performance related to teaching, learning processes, learning outcomes, faculty, research, infrastructure, and other parameters. What is the process? So the first step involves the applicant institution submitting a self-study report. So first the institution submits its own report based on quantitative and qualitative metrics. The data is subjected to validation by expert team of NAAC with quality reviewed during the site's visit by the peer team. So you have the involvement of the peer teams. According to the Government of India, of the 1,113 universities and almost 44,000 colleges in the All India Survey on Higher Education report, NAAC accredited almost 418 universities and 9,000 colleges as on January 31st, 2023. So this organization becomes important. Do remember the kind of mandate which this particular organization or this particular NAAC council has. That's it for this particular article. Now coming to the last article of the day, this deals with a specific species, that is Mithun. Now again, why this becomes important is because UPSC has had a habit of asking questions with respect to the species. So we have a particular conservation activity which is done to protect this Mithun, right? So let's go through the article. The Mithun, which is a semi-wild bovine creature, will soon start wearing a fluorescent collar to be visible enough for the drivers on the highway. So what usually happens is that these Mithun come on the road because as it's more warm, but unfortunately because of the collisions with different vehicles, they die. And therefore to prevent that, to give them so that the vehicles may know at a distance that you have a certain animal which is there on the road, they are being provided, the Mithuns are being provided with a fluorescent collar around their neck, right? The Mithun is a free-ranging animal and stays mostly in the jungles. Seeking warmth, the Mithun usually spend winter nights on the roads, leading to accidents fatal for humans and animals. Mithuns have a black or deep brown hide, which is the skin, making them less visible at night on the poorly lit highways, especially in the foggy stretches. In Arunachal Pradesh, the Mithun holds immense cultural significance. Please understand, this information becomes really important. And this is where the UPSC extracts the information and asks a question. Serving as a symbol for wealth and social status, often used as a form of currency for barter trade. Please know that you have these regions where there are a lot of tribal people and they still basically practice the barter trade. And especially seen as a crucial part of the bride price in the tribal marriages. Let's in detail study about it. So this Mithun is a heavily built semi-domesticated bovine species believed to have originated more than 8,000 years and a descendant of Indian wild boar or bison, known as the cattle of the mountain. Then next is, it is basically spread over the northeastern region of the country, with Arunachal Pradesh having the highest population. Then it is also found in the part of Southeast Asia in the countries like Bangladesh, Myanmar and Bhutan. The geographic zone is covered with tropical evergreen rainforest. Do remember, tropical evergreen rainforest. It is a state animal of Arunachal Pradesh and Nagaland. We have certain tribes which value this particular animal, which basically celebrate, commemorate the birth of the arrival of the Mithun on this particular earth. So basically they celebrate a particular festival known as the Saulung festival, right? Mithun appears somewhat similar to that of the guar. Like guars, they are strongly built, large-sized fleshy animals with a weight of almost 400 to 650 kgs. The characteristic features lies in the head, which has well-developed broad frontal bone and other things. You can have a look. Horn varies from whitish yellow to the salty black in most animals. The young Mithuns are light to dark brown in color, which darkens with the age, right? In adult Mithun, the most common color is black. The conservation status, IUCN Red List, it's vulnerable. According to the CITES, it is Appendix 1. This is the animal. Have a look. Again, this can be important. Have a reading of this particular information and probably you'll be able to solve a particular question of the prelims if it comes. So that is it for today. I hope you really enjoyed the session. Thank you so much. All the very best.